First Things, episode number 46.
I seem to be lost.
And so you're working around the clock so you don't take time for yourself to feel like an actual human being.
I used to feel like no matter how hard I worked, I was just spinning my wheels.
Trying to be perfect, we try to have everything in place at one point in time, and you can't.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to First Things, the podcast dedicated to practical productivity based on modern research. My name is Brandon Vaughn, and it's my goal to help you apply productive solutions to your life to help you live with less stress, greater passion, and amazing results. Great to have you back today as we are nearly finished with our study on assertiveness. Today is part 2 of dealing with confrontation. We are in chapter 16 of the Assertiveness workbook. If you are following along with us in that book, highly recommend that you pick up this book and have it as part of your library. Next week, we are going to do a wrap-up of the entire series on assertiveness. And I think it would be good to do a summary, although I've said so many things over these episodes. I mean, we have done quite a few episodes on this topic of assertiveness. This is the 17th episode on assertiveness, so basically about 17 hours on assertiveness that we've gone through, and I don't think I can summarize every single thing that I've said, but I do want to kind of get a high-level view of this. And I was thinking about this. I just recently got a comment from Marcus from Sweden, who wrote me saying that he enjoyed the podcast, really was enjoying the things that we were talking about, and was wondering if I had some sort of cheat sheet on the procrastination series, which I'm trying to think about what I can help Marcus with on that. But I thought, in line with that, providing a summary after we do these long series like this, what's the basic idea, what are the basic elements we've learned, I think that would be helpful. So next week, we're actually going to do a quick summary of the entire book, of the entire series, and kind of wrap up our conclusions. Plus, also, I found an interview with the author, a rare interview that you really can't find anywhere, and I'm going to play that as well on the show and get his summary of assertiveness as well. So last week, we talked about preparing for confrontation, how you want to be thinking about confrontation, how you may need to reevaluate whether you need to change, whether this is a battle that's even worth fighting, what kind of mindset you need to go into something that is a very confrontational issue. And then this week, we want to get into constructive confrontation. So now when you're actually in a confrontational moment, what are some tips and tricks that you can use to help you in that situation? So here's how the author begins this chapter. He says, so you've identified an issue, you've thought about it, you've realized that you really do need to work it out with the person involved, and you've worked your way through the steps identified in the last chapter. You have your plan and you know what you want to say. Now it's time to get to work. Sooner or later, the confrontation begins. Hopefully you are in a safe, comfortable environment where you can communicate both clearly and openly. The following is a set of recommendations to consider as the exchange occurs. You'll want to read them now, though, to help you be ready, or listen to them now to help you be ready. Now, of anything we've talked about in terms of your typical preference of communication style, whether you typically are aggressive or passive-aggressive, it helps to know that when it comes to this issue of confrontation. Because you will notice these styles really pop up when you're in a confrontational situation. If you typically are aggressive in your communication style, you will find as the communication gets more and more difficult, more and more heated, that your aggression side will start coming out in droves. If you are passive or more passive in your style of communication, you'll find the temptation to just avoid it altogether, or simply just give in to the other person at the first sign of disagreement. If you are passive-aggressive, you will find temptations to become very indirect or possibly even sarcastic in your reply when you're dealing with confrontation. So the author goes through several steps of dealing with confrontation or what to do when you're in the midst of confrontation. And as he said in the beginning, it's good to think about these ahead of time before you're actually in the heat of battle. The first one is just to simply relax. It's very important if you're in a confrontational situation to learn to relax during that conversation, during that discussion. And that can be very hard. It can be very, very tough. And I don't know how you prefer to relax, how you do it, if you breathe deeply, if you do some type of meditation, if you exercise, but you need to find something in your life that can be a trigger point to help you relax. For most of us, it's just simply breathing really deep, consciously thinking about breathing at that moment, taking very deep breaths. But you need to consciously sometimes do this. And yes, you think, well, yeah, if I do that, I'll look very strange. Well, who cares what people think? If you're in a confrontational situation, it's quite okay. I very seriously doubt many people are going to be thinking about your breathing. And if they do, they probably will understand maybe what you're trying to do. You need to remind yourself to breathe. You need to slow the pace of your breathing. You need to try to relax as much as possible. Now, granted, it's very tough. I've been in certain situations that were confrontational, and it was a huge problem for me to relax. I just couldn't relax. It was a very tense type of situation. But I've learned in those situations that the more I really can relax, the better off I really am. Second tip that he mentions is to watch your body language. It goes all the way back again to our earlier episodes with Vanessa Van Edwards, that talking about the importance of body language. And when you're in a very confrontational situation, your body language will deceive you. Your body language will betray you. Your body language will even put you at a disadvantage many times. We've got to be very careful about these types of things. We've got to really work on our body language. This is why I devoted a whole episode and introduced everyone to Vanessa. And she's not the only body language expert out there, but the reason why I mentioned her, because I really think this is something we've got to practice. We just can't think about body language and just expect it to be better. We really need to devote time in front of a mirror or with someone else where we practice our body language and look at what's going on, where we videotape ourselves and critique ourselves and become better at these types of things. My friends, to just be honest with you, most of us aren't very good, and I'm including myself in there. My hand is raised up high right now. I need a lot of work in this area, and I don't know very many people who don't need a lot of work in this area. We really have got to put some time and effort into this. Let me read what the author says about this. He says, during confrontation, it is easy to become very tense. You may clench your fist, or hunch your shoulders, or wrinkle your brow, or grit your teeth. Perhaps you will adopt an aggressive posture. You will move in too close. You will stare the other person down, and you will wear an angry expression on your face. This stance is likely to put others on the defensive, or may cause them to become aggressive in return. Alternatively, you may adopt a passive posture due to fear. You'll look down. You'll angle your body toward the floor. You will seldom make eye contact. You will wear a fearful expression. You will clutch your hands together. This will make it look like you don't really believe in your position. Instead, you need to adopt an open and relaxed posture. You need to sit back, keep a moderate amount of eye contact, let go of facial tension, smile when appropriate, avoid fidgeting. Oh boy, that's a big one for me. Avoid fidgeting and angle your body gently toward the other person. This stance communicates an expectation that the conflict can be resolved and that you will neither attack nor be attacked. It can be difficult to maintain this posture when inside you are feeling angry or frightened. Nevertheless, it can be very helpful to hold as relaxed a posture as you can, even if this means faking it a bit. The posture itself can affect your mind, helping you to calm yourself and stay present in the discussion. And for more of that, I would definitely invite you to go back and listen to the body language episode. And if you have not heard that episode, that is episode number 37. So you can go to firstthingsproductivity.com/37 and hear that episode, or look up episode number 37 on iTunes or anywhere that you're listening to. And I actually asked Vanessa a lot about that very thing, about how your body can change the way you think. It's a marvelous thing, actually, that the way that you sit or the way that you position yourself can actually feed your emotions, can actually help direct how you will respond or how you feel in a situation. And something the author says, which we also mentioned a little bit, I think, in that interview with Vanessa, is that sometimes you have to just fake it till you make it. You have to sometimes just do it. You may not feel like it. You may have to adopt a more assertive posture with your body, and you may not necessarily feel assertive at that particular time. And that's quite okay. Many times we get into this mindset of feeling like a hypocrite if we do something that we don't feel. And that's a trap we can get into. Oh, well, I don't feel this way, therefore I'm not going to position my body in this way. Well, no, that's just not how it works. If you wait until you feel that, you will wait usually until after the conversation's even over to begin with. You've got to seize the moment. You've got to be proactive and not live according to your feelings, not live according to your emotions. There's nothing wrong with emotions, nothing wrong with feelings whatsoever, but they cannot be the thermostat in your life. If you're going to use them as anything, you can use them as a thermometer of certain types of gauge temperature, but you can't let it set the direction for your life. And just because you don't feel like something doesn't mean that you can't live in the truth of something. So if you've listened to all these things about assertiveness and it really resonates with you and you know this is the pathway that you want to live with your life, you don't have to feel like that in order to walk in it. So work on your body language. Study the things that we talked about in episode 37. Go and check out some of Vanessa's courses on body language and learn how to be a better communicator with your hands and your face and your eyes and your mouth and your smile. We talked about this in that episode, and I don't want to rehash everything we talked about in that episode, but we talked a little bit about the fact that people fake smiles. And it's amazing how people think they're really good at that, and they're not. You can really spot a fake smile very easily from a real smile. We are just not very good at body language, especially assertive body language, and we've got to work on that. That's a huge thing when it comes to confrontational, and that is one thing that we can work on ahead of time. We can really work on our body language ahead of time, and when we get ourselves into confrontational situations, we should evaluate ourselves and see how we did. Now, this goes back to a whole nother episode that we talked about the fear of failure and how we need to use failure, not be so afraid of failure in our lives. If you're in a confrontational situation and you get out of that and you look back and think, man, I really blew it. Man, I just didn't do very good. I wasn't very assertive in that situation. I was more aggressive or I was more passive. Well, okay, now learn from that. Instead of beating yourself up over the fact that you could have done it this way, well, why didn't you do it that way? Were there things that triggered you certain ways? Were there certain things that snapped inside of you? What were those things? Now let's go and work on those. How was your body language? Well, I was slumped over, or I was a little bit too aggressive. Okay, now let's learn from that. Let's start practicing a new thing and start thinking about what would happen the next time. Let's use our failures in confrontation and become better the next time we face confrontation. We all have an amazing education in front of us called life. You don't have to go get a college degree. You don't need a PhD in order to learn to live life. You just need to seize the opportunities in your day-to-day life. Your family, your workplace is an amazing education if you just seize the opportunity, if you just embrace the failures in your life and learn from them. Another thing that can be very hard to do is to keep that even tone, keep that assertive body language, that assertive tone of voice, even if the other person starts doing the opposite. Have you ever been in a situation where the other person started talking loud? This is very common when somebody starts getting aggressive toward another person. If they start talking loud to you, you start talking loud back to them. So the louder they get, then the louder you get. And it's kind of a chain reaction. Sometimes when people start getting too soft, then the other person starts getting soft. And there's this chain reaction there. But definitely the other way, I've seen this happen so many times. When someone starts getting very loud, the person they're talking to starts getting very loud as well. You've got to do your best in those situations, that even if the person is at the point of shouting at you, that you maintain a very friendly, even tone, very calm toward them. In fact, it may help just to take a breath sometimes before you say something, because if you just start speaking out of your emotions will typically mimic the emotions that are around them. And just taking just 5 seconds just to breathe in and breathe out and then start speaking, just to get yourself in control, start speaking with an even tone in that situation. Another suggestion that he gives is to start with bonding. Here's what the author says about this. He says, most people feel threatened by conflict, and feeling threatened makes us react badly. When we are confronted, we wonder whether the friendship or relationship is over or whether we are about to be fired. Before we begin talking about your differences, it can be helpful to cement the relationship. Talk about what you do like before saying what you don't like. This can calm the person and help them to see that you are talking about a specific problem, not about their total worth as a human being. And he gives some examples, such as, first off, let me say that I've been pleased with your work overall the last few months. Start off the conversation like that. Or, I've really been enjoying traveling with you. Or, look at all the work you've finished, Katie. Well done. All this does is just help show people that they are valued and respected. And usually this is why people get aggressive or they snap back in a very hostile way if you confront them, is because they don't feel like you're valuing them or respecting them. So if you start off the conversation by basically saying something that they've done good, or confirming the fact that you want this relationship and the relationship is there, so don't think that something is bad and there is no relationship at all, well, it will help them not worry as much. It will help them not feel rejected by you. Now, one caveat of this that you've got to watch out for is that if you always do this, if you, in every relationship, you always give a positive message before a confrontation, people will learn that pattern and they will see, and you come to them with a compliment, they will be very suspicious of you. Oh, you're giving me a compliment, but you're about to unload something really bad on me. So you've got to be careful about that as well, that you don't use this technique all the time, but it is a good technique to use a lot of the time. That if you're going to sometimes give something that may be confrontational, well, start off by cementing the relationship. Let the person know that you value them, that you appreciate them, and now you're going to go into something that really matters to you and matters to you as part of this relationship. The next suggestion that he gives is to use your DESO script. Now, this is the third week we've talked about the DESO, and I won't go into all of that again, We first talked about this in our episode talking about asking for things. It just stands for describe, express, specify, and outcome. It's a formula basically for 4 steps for how to request something. And what the author says is you can also use these types of things when it comes to confrontation. You can describe the situation, you can express how you feel, you can specify what you would like to see change or what you want to see differently, and then express some of the outcomes of what will happen if the person does that or doesn't do that. The big thing, if you do this, so you don't need to go overboard and over-elaborate. And I've seen this, I've had a tendency to do this as well, where people will just go on and on, go through very lengthy discussion or elaboration of your point. Fact is, if you do that, people will just quit listening to you. I mean, think about when that happens to you. I can think about when that happens to me and someone just goes on and on and on. I start tuning them out. I quit listening to them. I realize that they're not really listening to me, and that the longer they speak, the more frustrated I get because they're not listening to me. They're not allowing me to respond. And thus, it's much more tempting to become more aggressive in that type of situation. Now, some of us worry that the other person isn't going to understand us, and that's why we go overboard and explain and explain and explain something over and over again, and just don't stop at that type of stuff. Well, we've got to understand and respect, again, the assertive approach is going to respect the other person's dignity of choice. So if the other person doesn't understand us, they can ask us to clarify that. That's their right. We should be willing just to state it very simply and not feel like we have to give an elaborate explanation of it. We state it very simply in as few words as we can. If the other person doesn't understand us, they can ask us, and that's how we should go into it. I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to be very to the point. I'm not going to be vague. I'm going to be specific, but I'm not just going to go on and on. And I realize that when I say this, if the person doesn't really get me, they have the right to ask me. And I'm not just going to assume they don't understand me and make a 5-minute request into a 40-minute lecture. Now, some of us, too, we do that because we fear what the other person's going to say. So we keep talking because we don't want to hear what they have to say. And therefore, we hope, I think subconsciously, that if we just keep talking, that maybe they will just get exhausted and they won't respond, and then we'll feel better because we fear that exchange that may come afterwards. Fact is, we've just got to respect other people. That's the assertive way. If you make a request from someone, if you confront someone, you've got to state your point, then sit back and allow the response to come. You've got to allow them to respond to you. You've got to allow them to say something. If you're going to give a negative consequence, negative outcome, as far as them not doing what you're asking them or what you're confronting them about, you've got to be careful not to do that too early in the conversation. Otherwise, it can come across as a threat. It's usually best to give a positive outcome that you hope for instead of a negative outcome. As the author mentions in the book, he says instead of saying, otherwise I'll talk to your employer, you could frame it positively, and then I think we'll get along much better, or something like that. Go back 2 episodes ago to episode number 44, I believe, and we talk about this DESO script, and we talk a lot about framing things more positively in terms of outcome than negatively. Now, for parents, here's what the author says about doing this with children and confronting children about things. He says, with children, you may wish to make negative consequences a bit clearer than you might with adults, and you might give them somewhat earlier in the process. For example, by 8 p.m., or you won't be able to go on the sleepover. If it is often possible, however, to frame consequences positively, rather than saying, no movie unless the garbage is out. You could say, and once the garbage is out, you can watch the movie. The latter statement presumes that your son will take the garbage out, whereas the former presumes that he won't. This principle applies to communication with adults as well, but can be especially helpful with children. The next tip that he gives is to take responsibility. Try to use I messages as often as possible. We talked about this in the episode on making requests, to avoid blaming other people. So instead of saying, you make me feel miserable when you do that, just state it more in terms of yourself. I feel really bad when this happens. Now, it may be true that they make you feel miserable when they do that, but you've got to remember that your emotions are your responsibility, not theirs. You aren't responsible for them. You are responsible for you. Your emotions are your responsibility. And if you try to make other people responsible for how you feel, it's going to put them on the defensive, and very few problems are ever solved that way. So a better way of saying that, instead of saying, you make me feel miserable when you do that, say, when that happens, I feel miserable. It's a very subtle difference, but it's very important because you're not trying to blame them for how you feel. Quite frankly, you're responsible for how you feel. If you are feeling depressed, it's usually because you're thinking depressing thoughts. If you feel sad, it's probably because you're thinking sad thoughts, and you're acting on those types of things. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but if you look at your own life, you'll find that it's pretty true. The author says this. He says, also, take responsibility for your choice of consequences and your decision to act on them. For example, if this doesn't change, I plan to begin searching for another position. Avoid blaming the consequences on the other person with you statements. You leave me no choice. You will force me to take legal action. These statements are not really true. The person isn't forcing you to do anything. You are choosing to react in a certain way. Admit it. Make it clear that your response will depend on theirs. If you don't do it, then I will, but don't deny that it still is your choice. Another step, which could be controversial, you have to really think about this. Maybe it's not that controversial, but his statement is don't try to win. We want usually total victory, but it never happens. It seldom happens. And what usually happens in a very effective confrontation is you find compromise and you find mutual solving solutions. As Stephen Covey used to say, you search for win-win solutions, a solution in which both parties feel like they win as part of it. It may not be exactly what you wanted. It may not be the perfect solution, but it is a winnable solution for you. Fact is, if we go into a confrontation thinking that the goal is winning, that we're going to win our position and everyone's got to agree with us, that you're just in a bad state to go into a confrontation with that. And this is actually a huge secret. It is for me, at least, that when I go into a confrontation, I realize that the point is not that I defend myself, not that I make the other person see it my way, that I prove that the other person is wrong. Those are usually what goes into my mind the very first thing. I have to realize, wait a minute, the goal in this situation is compromise. The goal in this situation is that we come to a win-win situation. Now, that is difficult if the other person doesn't have the same motive. So if the other person is coming in with the motive that I'm going to win and I'm not going to budge, well, then that makes it even more difficult. And quite frankly, the only things that you usually can do in that situation is try to push for a win-win situation and be very transparent with the other person. I think you're saying this, I'm feeling this. Don't you feel like we should find a compromise between these two positions that we both feel good about? And you may actually have to educate someone about a win-win situation and the fact that a compromise of what you both feel is an acceptable solution to this is what it's all about. Another tip is to avoid old history. And basically what the author is saying in this is we got to resist the temptation of bringing up past events. Well, you remember the time that you did this, and focus on one topic at a time. One topic is enough to handle at one time, especially if you're dealing with a confrontational issue. Don't bring up others. Don't bring up old history. Don't try to solve all of the problems at once. Focus on something very specific. Another tip is to absolutely avoid absolutes. The fact is, the more convinced we are of our position going into a confrontational dialogue, the more tempted we will be to use absolutes. You never do this. You're always this way. You constantly do this. Every time I come in, this is happening. Whenever I see you, this is going on. You invariably do this. All of these absolute words, everything, nothing, all of the time, none of the time. We've got to avoid doing that. You know what happens when we do this? Think about this in your own life when it happens to you. Think about how you respond. If someone gives you an absolute, you are tempting the other person to debate. You are tempting the other person to prove you wrong with one example of that. I don't know if you remember this back in math, but if you were going to prove something true, it's very hard to do because you have to prove it almost in every instance. But if you're going to prove something is false, it's very easy. You just need to give one instance. So if someone says an absolute is true, all you have to do is just show one instance in which it's false, and then the whole argument is trashed. And that's why we want to avoid absolutes when we're talking to people. Well, you never get this report in on time, and you're tempting the other person to say, oh, but wait a minute. You remember back in September, I got it to you 2 days early. Well, then your whole argument's waste. You lose, they win the point. What we usually mean when we give these absolutes is not always, but most often this is the case. Or in saying you're always this way, you're never this way, we usually mean, well, less often this is the case. You do turn in the report on time sometimes, but usually I have to finish it up. That's what you really mean to say instead of saying you always are late. When you use absolutes, you're going to invite argument. You're going to invite defensiveness from the other person. We've got to avoid that type of thing. The next point is to listen. Here's what the author says about this. He says, during confrontations, we are often so wrapped up in our own opinion and what we want to say next that we don't listen. The other person usually senses this, becomes frustrated, and stops listening as well. No conflict can be solved without communication, and no communication can occur without listening. Pay attention to the points the other person makes. Show that you are listening. When you think you understand what they are saying, say it back to them in your own words. This is called a reflection of content. Don't twist it. So you're saying I'm stupid, is that it? This only shows that you weren't listening. If the other person doesn't agree that you have it right, then you don't. To resolve the conflict, you have to understand their viewpoint. You don't have to agree with it, but you do have to understand it. If you don't understand it, you can't solve the problem. For example, okay, let me see if I'm understanding you. When I ask you to be on time, you feel a bit like you're trapped, as though your life is not your own anymore. Like you're a little kid having to be on time for school? Is that close? See, that's much better, and that's listening to a person, and it's getting confirmation that you got it right. It's not using symbolic words like we said earlier. So you're saying I'm stupid. No, that's a leap. That's an interpretation of what they're saying. That isn't usually what they're saying. And if you want some help on that, you can go back to episode number 14 of First Things. I have a whole podcast called The Lost Art of Listening, where we talk about how to be a better listener and some of the tips and tricks that you might want to put into place to be a better listener. FirstThingsProductivity.com/14 will land you on that episode. Kind of funny how I've got so many episodes now that I can actually say, hey, if you want to hear more about this, go back to this podcast. And if you want to hear more about failure, go back to here. If you want to hear more about listening, it's an unusual thing, because when I first started this, I didn't have these episodes and I was just thinking about these, but now I actually have whole episodes where I can talk about these things, which is pretty cool. Another suggestion is to find some common ground. Find some areas in which you do agree. Find some commonality. It cannot be that everything is a disagreement. It's very unusual, I think, in most situations that every single thing is a disagreement. Usually there's going to be some things that you have in common that you agree about. And look for that common ground. Point it out. Differences are usually very obvious, but it helps if you can talk out the commonality, the common ground that you actually have with the other person on this particular issue. Another suggestion is to give points to the other side. Now, this can be a very tough thing to do. And when you're in the middle of a confrontation, you can feel very reluctant to acknowledge what the other person is saying, that to acknowledge the other person has some good points to what they're saying. Because we usually feel like in order to acknowledge that another person has a very good point, it makes us powerless. It makes us weak. It gives them the advantage. And if we already feel like the other person has the upper hand on us, if we already feel like we are at a disadvantage to this other person, we may be very reluctant to make this other person feel even stronger. And this is what's going through our head, why we don't want to acknowledge that the other person may actually have some good points. But the fact is, if we don't give the other person credit for these points, they usually will feel like we aren't listening to them, that we don't value them in some way. We aren't really weakening our position by agreeing with them on certain points. We are building common ground. We're showing that we're willing to listen, that the other person really has something to say. And as such, the other person will usually be more willing to listen to us. I've discovered this many times when I've dealt with situations. It's funny, I was thinking the other day, I talk about these situations, and it's not like confrontation happens in my life all the time. I was thinking last week, I said something, and I think, wow, I wonder if people think that, man, Brandon, what's going on in your life? Because it sounds like all you deal with is people constantly confronting you and being mean to you, and that's not the case. It's not a regular occurrence in my life. But I think back a couple of times, when people had their own agendas and they focused on me as their point of that, and they were very confrontational to me. And the natural habit is to bristle up and to either attack them or to fortify myself and stand behind my shield and basically resist them. And I found so often, and this has come through failure, not so much through reading a book like this, but I've learned through failure to listen to other people and to acknowledge what they had to say and say, well, I can understand why you're saying that, and I think you have a really good point about that. That's very hard to say sometimes. But I can tell you that when you do that, that most of the time that I've done that, there's an atmospheric change in the room. I don't know what it is. The other person thought I would basically resist them, that they're in there, they're fighting this agenda of theirs. And when I actually say, you had a good point there, and I think that was really well spoken, something changes usually in that person. They soften a little bit. They start relaxing a little bit. They start listening to me. Doesn't mean that they still don't have an agenda and that they may be communicating it very well, but there's just an atmospheric change to this whole thing. And you should try this. Doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything they're saying, but if someone makes a good point, something that you do agree with, well, then acknowledge that and see what kind of a difference it makes in that kind of confrontational environment. Another point is to not counterattack. If you feel attacked, there's a big temptation to become an attacker yourself and to start attacking them. And this is where we can start pulling up stuff from history. Well, you remember the time you did this to me, and we start attacking to try to protect ourselves. Just remember that the goal is not to prevent the other person from pushing your buttons. You cannot control their behavior. The only behavior you can control is yours. Many times what you have to do in these situations when someone starts becoming very pushy and they're trying to push your buttons is to go back to some of the things we talked about in the previous episode on assertiveness, the very first episode I ever did over assertiveness, which is episode 909. And I talk about some techniques in there to dealing with people, such as the infinity loop, where you just come back and you keep saying the same thing. And so many times when people start getting off of tangents, well, you remember you said this and you did this, and you say, well, yes, but we're not talking about that right now. What we're talking about is this thing. And you have to be very resilient and not let people push your buttons. We've got to be very careful to keep our anger on a leash, because usually aggression produces aggression, especially in confrontational situations. And you know what happens. Someone throws an insult, and then the other person throws a rock, and then the other person throws a grenade, and then the other person throws a bomb, and then the other person throws a missile, and then the other person throws a nuclear missile. Nothing gets resolved in that type of situation. The thing just gets worse and worse and worse. You've got to keep your emotions in check. And guess what? If you can't, if something gets so heated that your emotions are just out of control, well, give yourself the dignity of space. Just say to that other person, I'm getting upset and I can't really discuss this clearly right now. I'd like to take a breather and try again tomorrow. Would that be okay with you? And just shut it down. Now, the last tip for today is to wait out silences. Now, I told you this a few weeks ago, and I said to be careful about this because it can be used for manipulative purposes. And the fact is that if you sit in silence with someone, it can make them a little bit uncomfortable, and it can actually soften them in many ways. So if someone is just blasting away and you sit there and you don't say anything, it's amazing how it will suddenly make them very self-conscious, very uncomfortable. They will suddenly start speaking faster, reiterate things, and this can be sometimes a very interesting communication tool that you can use to help yourself in certain situations. But we've got to be very careful that we're not using it to manipulate people or to control other people. Now, having said that, we've got to also be aware that other people may use that on us, so that if we're talking to someone or we're in a confrontational situation, the other person may suddenly become very silent. And if they become very silent, it can be used to control us, or they may be attempting to control us. We've got to sit back and relax, do our best job to relax, tolerate that silence, wait for the other person to respond, because eventually they will. If the silence just keeps going on and on and on, you can ask someone to comment. I'd like to hear what you have to say about my request. Don't change your position until the other person has stated theirs. Wait that silence out. Or if the other person is silent, just end the conversation and move on. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode today on confrontation. Hope some of these tips have helped. Some of the things we've talked about maybe gives you some ideas of how to deal with confrontation in your life, where we're going. And that effectively ends this book. Can you believe it? It's going to end up this series on assertiveness, but we still have one more episode. So as I said at the beginning of the episode, next week we're going to spend 5-10 minutes probably talking about just the overall ideas of assertiveness. We've been talking about this for, what did I say, 17 hours, 15, 16 hours, a lot of hours. So what have we said? If we're going to summarize this entire book, probably we'll just go through chapter by chapter, just say, here's what we're saying in each one of these things, here's what the overall message is, and then we'll end up with about a 20 or 30 minute interview that I've dug up from the archives with this actual author and talk about how he sees assertiveness. And then, like I said earlier, last week I think, then we're going to probably do a few one-off episodes, talk about some of my email experiments, talk about social media etiquette and things like that, things that can really trap us up in life. I want to talk a little bit about success. Even thought about starting up a few series maybe that would help me write a book, because I've been wanting to write a book for a long time now, and I've actually thought the other week, I should start it off during the podcast and talk about my thoughts on many things, and then that way I could flesh them out and then turn around and write a book on them if I wanted to. As always, please consider leaving me any ratings and comments on iTunes. Just helps get the word out. If you really love the show, would love to hear from you. Also, you can leave me comments at firstthingsproductivity.com/46, as in episode 46. As I said, I got some great comments there in the last few weeks from Marcus from Sweden. Says, I especially enjoy that you bring the question, is this true, to the subjects, instead of presenting yourself as an authority that just knows, like the authors of most of the self-help books that I've read. Antonio left me a message over the Myth of Multitasking podcast. It says, I was listening to the podcast while doing other things. These other things were new for me, and though they were repetitive and very complicated, they were new to me. I wanted to paint and replace the silicone in the bathroom. I realized that I couldn't follow your post. The multitasking didn't really work. I guess because the action, although easy, was new for me, so I ended up turning off my MP3 player. Thanks very much for your work. It's so valuable to me. So thank you, Antonio, for your comments. So just again to tell everyone, I really read your comments. Sometimes I get a little late in responding to my discussion comments, but I'm always reading them and always taking them to heart, really listening to what you have to say, and very much value them. So until next time, remember this. Confrontation will eventually happen in your life. Plan for it. Think about your body language. Think about your tone of voice. Think about how you will respond. And most important, look back in your life at your failures in confrontation and learn from them. Why did you fail? What could you have done better? Did the other person get the upper hand on you? How did you respond? Did their aggression fuel your aggression? learn from these things. Remember that assertiveness is not about getting your own way. It's about valuing everyone's choice. It is about taking responsibility for how you react and how you feel. That is true assertiveness. As always, embrace today with passion and intention, and don't die with your music still inside you.